so this is again his contribution. Susan thought I wasn't pulling my weight. We were arguing. Sue's way of dealing with things was to talk until I gave in. She could talk for 3 hours. I think I was pushing back at that time. She does not appear to have attended a mental health practitioner for her own mental health until after February 2016. Although there's a possibility that she may have consulted a clinical psychologist 8 years ago, although this is also unconfirmed and unclear. Her daughter described that her mother became very involved in an argument and struggled to let go of a point. This was a long-standing trait, but was significantly noted by the marriage counselor. And her daughter described that she could go on and on for 3 days. This is a quote. We could have an argument at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. It would be over in my mind. We would walk into my room. She would walk into my room at 2 a.m. in the morning and carry on and on and on. Because she didn't sleep, she would twist things in her mind. Like, for example, if Zoe took my pen, she would rant and twist things to say that maybe I took Zoe's pen. She used that as an example to explain what she meant. She, by this I mean Mrs. Rohde, had a long-standing mistrust of men relating to affairs. That was confirmed, my lady, by a friend of the family that had known her for a very long time, as well as her own psychologist. Her father had had an extramarital affair that she had discovered. Mr. Rohde indicated that his wife had experienced 3 life events that had had a profound effect on her. His affair, her father's affair, and her grandfather's death. My lady, this point has been disputed, I see, during the testimony of Mr. Rohde, but just to point out that Mrs. Rohde's psychologist, Jane Newcomb, was very clear, and Susan Rohde's own notes were clear, that the impact of her father's affair was important in her life. Nothing more, nothing less, but it was nonetheless there. She was good, point 28.13. She was good at concealing her feelings from her friends. This was described as consistent and long-standing. This is further evidenced by affidavits from her friends. My lady, later will talk more about the fact that there is no one other than her professional, the people she sought professional help from, that knew that her husband was having an affair or knew any of these pains and hurts that she was experiencing. And this is important, my lady, because it sets the stage for her social isolation. There's a pattern of secrecy, 28.14, amongst family members, between the daughters and between various family combinations. What I mean by that, my lady, is that 2 of them know something they don't tell the other one, and that is accepted within that. Point 29. There was a significant observable change in Mrs. Rohde in the months before her death. Each of the symptoms below, listed below, has been described by someone other than the accused unless otherwise specified. My lady, at this point, I would like to make reference to 3 articles, because I think it would be helpful, before I list them, and when present to the court a random list of things, I think it might be useful, if the court would agree, to just make reference, particularly to the article from the DSM, which is the sort of psychiatry dictionary, if I can put it that way, to 2 major subheadings, well, one with an addition, that of major depressive episode, and the other with the specifiers of with anxious distress and with mixed mood disorder. Would be in order to do that.
Please carry on.
Yes, with that.
Please.
My lady, does the court have my file that I made, a copy of my file?
I've only got your report, and it was handed up as annexures. Triple N 1, 2, 3.
The articles.
The articles?
Yes.
Is it this file?
Yes.
Just show this to Dr. Panieri-Peter. It should be in there. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
lady, the first on top of, I think my CV might be on top of that, but on this, it should read major depressive episode at the bottom.
Got that?
Okay. My lady, I have not highlighted the document so that the court, so that it can never be said that I'm trying to direct only to a specific part of it. But should the court request highlighted, mine is highlighted. So if that makes it easier, then I'm very happy to hand mine in.
Well, mine's not highlighted, but I can see where the original from which this was copied was highlighted.
Oh dear, sorry. Right, my lady, before I talk about this, I want to just contextualize what the DSM is. My lady, the DSM is essentially like a psychiatry dictionary, but it is at no point, there is in fact a cautionary paragraph, like a heading. It's called a cautionary statement for forensic use in the DSM. I haven't copied it for this point. But one of the important principles in psychiatry is that things occur on a spectrum, from mild to very severe, and at no point can one ever, or should one, clinically, and especially in a forensic context, but clinically too, say, because one has this number versus that number, there's a magical line between those things. There isn't. These terminologies are quite exact, like you need 5 out of 9, or however many in different diagnoses, because what they mean by that is that if you do research in Poland, or you do research in the United States, when they use a term, we're meaning the same thing. That's really what it is. It's like a universal language. What it is not is a way of saying to a psychiatrist, if your patient only has 2 out of 9, 4 out of 9, that means they don't have something, they don't require treatment, and they're not sick. That's not what its intention is. And a lady, with medical students and psychiatry registrars, we spend an enormous amount of time drilling that point, because otherwise it can be grossly misused. To go through, in this case, or to go through the key points that I want to draw to attention before we continue on paragraph 29. When Ms. Newcomb was here, she named 4 out of 9 points. When the marriage counsellor was here, she listed 6 out of 9 points. At this point, my lady, I'm just going to go through what they are. It says here the diagnostic criteria. You need 5 or more of the following symptoms that have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the following, either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. Then point 1, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either subjective report, i.e. subjective being that one says it oneself, subjective report feeling sad, empty or hopeless, or observation made by others, e.g. appears tearful. Note in children and adolescents, and actually my lady, in adults too, it can also be irritable mood. Point 2, a marked diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities of most of the day, nearly every day. Point 3, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, i.e. change of more than 5% of body weight, or decrease or increase in appetite nearly every day. Point 4, insomnia or hypersomnia, which means to sleep all the time, nearly every day. Point 5, psychomotor agitation or retardation every day, observable by others, not merely subjective feelings of restlessness or being slowed down. Psychomotor agitation, my lady, I'm going to spend quite a lot of time talking about in detail, but essentially it is pacing, being more talkative, being a little bit less able to control what you say, feeling agitated. It is often described by patients clinically and is often referred as anxiety. In fact, one of the commonest things I see when patients are referred to me is they say, I feel very anxious, and yet they are agitated. And when we talk about the distinction between those things, they're able to then say, actually, it's more agitation. But I'll talk more about that now. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Point 7, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, which may be delusional nearly every day. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day, either by subjective account or observed by others. And point 9, recurrent thoughts of death, not just fear of dying, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or a suicide attempt or specific plan for committing suicide. There's more that goes on about specifies, etc., which is one can read. My lady, if one goes to page 162, this is the key thing. There are these specifiers in the bit here, in the center part. It says with anxious distress or with mixed features. Now, my lady, if one goes then the next article, my lady, it's not actually an article, it's just a subsection in the bundle. Okay? Specifies for depressive disorders. It's page 184. With anxious distress or with mixed features. Now, with anxious distress, it says specify if anxious distress is defined as the presence of at least 2 of the following symptoms during the majority of the days of a major depressive episode. Point 1, feeling keyed up or tense. Point 2, feeling unusually restless. Point 3, difficulty concentrating because of worry. Point 4, feeling that something awful may happen. Sorry, it says fear. Point 5, feeling that the individual might lose control of himself or herself. Then under note, it says, anxious distress has been noted as a prominent feature of both bipolar and major depressive disorder in both primary care and mental health settings. High levels of anxiety have been associated with higher suicide risk, longer duration of illness, and greater likelihood of treatment non-responsiveness. Then with mixed features, I'm going to read what this says, my lady, and then I'm going to describe a mixed state because it's a little bit complex. It says here, point A, at least 3 of the following manic stroke hypomanic symptoms, I'll explain that now, are present nearly every day during the majority of days of a major depressive episode. 1, elevated, expansive mood. 2, inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. 3, more talkative than usual or pressure to keep talking. 4, flight of ideas or subjective experience that thoughts are racing. Point 5, increase in energy or goal-directed experience. Point 6, increase or excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequence. And point 7, decreased need for sleep. Point B, mixed symptoms are observable by others and represent a change from the person's previous behavior. Note, mixed features are associated with major depressive episode and have been found to be a significant risk factor for the development of bipolar and bipolar 2 disorders, but that's not particularly good. My lady, those are the 2 things. The third one is the third point there, and it's simply 1 paragraph. It says activated depression. It's the third article. Under abstract, the combination of depression and activation presents clinical and diagnostic challenges. Then under introduction, my lady, there's one sentence I'd like to read, or it's 2 sentences. It is easy to view depression and activation as opposites, yet depression and activation are often combined with the potential for serious consequences, including poor impulse control and especially suicidal behavior. It is necessary to understand these combinations in order to understand, diagnose, and treat. Okay. My lady, the concept of a mixed mood state, I just want to explain that in clinical and not in a list. It is quite a difficult entity to actually imagine, I think, if one hasn't experienced it or worked with it. And I explain it to patients like this. It is a state in which one feels incredibly sad, restless, agitated, sometimes happy and energetic, all at the same time, but it is a very unpleasant space to be in. It is an unpleasant space. This mixed mood state, my lady, is a way of describing what sometimes was called an agitated depression, depression that becomes agitated. And it can also occur in other conditions. It can occur in bipolar illnesses and other illnesses. It can be caused by medications, it can be caused by a range of things. But essentially, it is a particularly dangerous mental state. And it is a state that can actually sometimes happen when someone is getting better from a depression. So it's one of the reasons why if one reads articles and says antidepressants cause suicide, it's not so much that, it's that as patients are put on that, they can go into a mixed state and they can become more agitated. And in that state, people can be activated to actually place themselves in danger. Right, paragraph 29. I'm sorry for the digression, my lady, but I hope that in reading this, it makes the reading of it seem to have more meaning. Paragraph 29.1. Mrs. Rohde lost a lot of weight. The amount of approximately 8 kilograms has been mentioned, and she gave her underwear to her housekeeper as it no longer fitted her. Her appearance was worrying to a number of people whom I interviewed, and she excused her weight loss as being due to her running. She was more preoccupied with being fat and of her weight and her daughter's weight than ever before, even more than before. She attended gym more often than before. She actually started going to gym with her husband. She became very anxious. She looked upset at home at times. She was seen to be agitated. She became more talkative and agitated at times, and that's been substantiated by more than one person, by many more than one person. She argued excessively and more than previously with her daughters. These arguments became physical on occasion, and her daughter's description of regret and sadness about this was very sad. Her daughter described her mother's change in behavior. I think it all started in the beginning of the year. My dad hasn't told me. I could see she was flat panicked about everything. My mom said I was fat all the time. My mom told us all that. My mom was so skinny that compared to her, we were fat. She lost lots of weight. She and my dad would speak privately a lot. She would check my dad's phone all the time. She would make me check his phone. Me and my dad's phone was linked on iCloud. You know when something is going on and you want to deny it. My mom thought he was going to cheat. Even one time my dad was driving in Cape Town and I could see his Uber. I didn't even realize she was following my dad's Uber. She was having like a panic attack. She kept calling him. She was like freaking out. When asked what freaking out looked like, she said she was very fidgety and you could see it in her eyes. Mrs. Rohde tracked her husband's whereabouts and became preoccupied with his cell phone and where he was. This was described as obsessive by the marriage counselor, and Mr. Rohde's clinical psychologist was also concerned. Reference is made in court to 1,703 calls and 2,229 WhatsApp messages. She shared her preoccupation with her daughters and involved them in her stalking behavior. She was preoccupied with details and evidence of the affair, and many examples were provided by a number of sources. Mrs. Rohde's sleeping pattern deteriorated so that it became even worse than previously. Note is made of this by her general medical practitioner. The doctor's note of the 13th of May 2016 reads, Vandag vir Botox, today for Botox, wil ook voorskrif vir Dormicum hê, also wants a prescription of Dormicum, al hele lewe lang insomnia, all her whole life insomnia, het by 'n vriendin paar gekry, got some, I'm assuming pills from a friend, maar puffy soggens, is puffy in the morning, thuis behandel met Somnol, currently treated with Somnol, werk nie regtig nie, not working, soms 5 dae, waar net 2 tot 3 ure slaap. Sometimes 5 days, in which just 2 to 3 hours of sleep. My lady, at this point, this is a very important point, and it simply can be referenced by a passing sentence in relationship to the 4th article in the bundle, entitled Sleep Disturbances and Suicidality, a common association to look for in clinical practice and preventative care. My lady, increasingly, this article is a 2011 article. I have more 2017 articles, but again, I didn't want to overload the bundle. Essentially, something we didn't know when I was a medical student is that sleep disturbances now are independently associated with very poor mental health outcomes. Sleep disturbance is common, we know that, but in fact, the huge body of psychiatry at the moment is actually talking about resilience and what makes people resilient and how to encourage resilience, and sleep is the center of it all. Not being able to sleep is a very significant problem. So sleep difficulty occurs in other disorders, for example, depression and other disorders, but independently, just sleep problems on their own. I know it sounds counterintuitive, and that's why the literature is actually starting to write about it, and there's a growing body of evidence about it, is because one kind of thinks, well, a lot of people can't sleep, can't be that significant, and a lot of people take sleeping pills, but in fact, it is increasingly significant. And obviously, it also can be a marker of mental illness in itself, but even independently, it's a worry. Point 29.14. Yes.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Her general medical practitioner notes in her clinical notes that Mrs. Rohde was teary, had severe insomnia, and could not eat and had lost weight. My lady, I think maybe just one point is that 2 to 3 hours sleep for 5 days is actually not, in psychiatric sense, a little bit of sleep disturbance. It actually, that alone meets the criteria for, in fact, another serious mental illness, but I'll talk about that later. It's a very, very significant observation. Sometimes 5 days in a row where she only sleeps 2 to 3 hours a night. Sorry, I've just lost my place for a moment. Okay, 29.15. Mrs. Rohde was described as very anxious, panicked, agitated, hypomanic. That was prefaced as not being a formal diagnosis. Restless, a stress ball, fidgety, destroyed, and highly agitated. The term hypomanic, actually, my lady, was just, her marriage counselor used that term, and she used some other terms. What it actually means, it's a very strange word. If mania is the sort of extreme elevation of elevated mood, what we imagine in bipolar 1, very loud, very expansive, very talkative, all those things. Hypomania just means slightly below that. So if normal mood, it sounds like hyper, but it's actually hypo, which means below. So it is a state of elevation that doesn't quite reach the level of mania. But she was very careful that she said, but she's not making that diagnosis. 29.16. Her agitation and anxiety were seen to be worse when her husband traveled. Her behavior was quite extreme in this regard, and she messaged his therapist as to his suspected behavior. His therapist commented on that. Mrs. Long commented on that too. Mrs. Rohde, sorry, my lady, it's Mrs. Rohde, paced up and down when distressed. Her marriage counselor was very concerned about her mental health and recommended admission to hospital. The marriage counselor, that's the she referred to there, even SMS'd both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde suggesting emergency admission. She described that Mrs. Rohde did not want her friends or family to know. The marriage counselor was very concerned, she said to me, about a look in her eyes, and she considered that Mrs. Rohde may be a suicide risk, and that there was reason, and that was the reason she suggested hospital admission. Mrs. Nader even called the psychiatrist, she gave me the name of the person she called, herself to try to arrange an urgent hospital admission for Mrs. Rohde. And she describes that she recommended admission for Mrs. Rohde on more than one occasion. The marriage counselor said to me, she was agitated, she was talkative, very. She was hyperactive, she would get up in the room and pace up and down. She would sometimes get right into his face. I was so worried about her. I said, please get help. I said, go to the clinic, Sue. I said to Jason, if you are worried, please go to the Santon or Crescent Clinic. There is always a psychiatrist on duty there. I felt so dismissed by them. She told me, my lady, she said, they looked at her and they didn't take her seriously. They looked at me like this doesn't happen to us. I was so worried, I sent an SMS to both Susan and Jason. I didn't keep the message on my phone. I recommended a psychiatric emergency clinic. She was so unwell that I thought maybe I wouldn't see them on a Monday because there would have been an admission. She didn't want her friends to know. She said in the session she was not going to share it, that's the information about the affair, with her mother. My lady, the court actually has my original notes on that particular interview that I had with the...
It also has Mrs. Taylor's evidence.
Yes, but... Yes.
Carry on, please.
Mrs. Rohde did not tell the family of origin about what was happening in her life in the months before she died. The daughter explained that her mother would never have told others what was happening in her life. She indicated that her mother believed telling people you had problems meant that you were weak. Many commented that Mrs. Rohde was attached to the notion of a perfect family, and that Mrs. Rohde was a private person who did not like to discuss weaknesses, worries, or failings in herself, her marriage, or her family with others. There was no one with whom I've spoken or from whom I've seen affidavits or read the court transcript of, other than the mental health professionals who knew that Mrs. Rohde was consulting a clinical psychologist or a marriage counselor, or knew that her husband was having an affair. She was thus isolated from family and friends in regard to what was consuming most of her energy at the time. Symptoms mentioned in the marriage counselor's notes included words in relation to Mrs. Rohde as low mood, agitation, depressed and jumpy, emotional pain, hyperarousal, concern about a possible suicide risk, and emotions being up and down. Mr. Rohde's clinical psychologist, Ms. Long, consulted with Mrs. Rohde on one occasion alone in March 2016. She described Mrs. Rohde as agitated and anxious. Mrs. Rohde did not describe her feelings to her, but seemed preoccupied and obsessed with finding details of her husband's extramarital affair. She also did not discuss her children with Mr. Rohde's clinical psychologist. She wanted Mr. Rohde's clinical psychologist to suggest ways to her husband to heal the marriage. The marriage counselor indicated that Mrs. Rohde's mental state was at its worst in March and April of 2016. I think that was shortly after they started consulting her. And then again in the weeks prior to the trip to Speer in Cape Town where Mrs. Rohde died. Another friend, my lady, also confirmed that because one of the friends interviewed saw her 2 weeks prior to her death, and said that that was a night in which he'd actually seen her to be so distressed that he'd actually taken her aside and asked her if she was okay. Mrs. Rohde did not pursue the psychologist's recommendation made by the marriage counselor, but chose her own clinical psychologist after attending a lecture by that psychologist, Ms. Newcomb, entitled Depression and Suicide, or Depression and Fatal Illness and Ordinary Unhappiness, When to Refer. I wasn't actually sure what the title was. There were two different titles given. Notes in Mrs. Rohde's own handwriting tell us the following. My lady, these sentences in 29.26.1 and below, they come directly from Mrs. Rohde's own handwriting in the notes of the psychologist, of her psychologist. It says, she thinks she's depressed, she has anxiety a lot of the time, she's quick-tempered, she's high energy, she feels she's battling to cope. She is questioning everything in her relationship, herself and her husband. She is lacking in self-esteem. She is drinking more alcohol than before. She has no one to emotionally support her. She has conflictual relationships with all her family members. All her children are starting to push back with restrictions on them. She had anxiety in childhood. Her parents had a volatile marriage. She had a poor and conflictual relationship with her father, and she expressed that family members were emotionally hostile. In her handwriting. She was diagnosed with a blood disorder at 15 and a past history of seizures and blackouts. She did not have a faith or religion. Her approach to illness is to believe she could not cope. She could cope. She had not told her family or anyone else about the affair. My lady, the reason I talk about faith and religion, or I mention that, is because having a faith or religion is a protective factor for people in terms of mental health, and particularly in relationships to suicide. Point 29.27, she last consulted with her general practitioner on the 24th of June 2016, a month prior to her death. She was described as being baie heilerig, very tearful. She was prescribed hypnotic medications, Urbinol and Stilnox, by her general practitioner, who she saw mainly for Botox injections. The relevant clinical note for that day reads, het baie konflik in lewe op die oomblik, has a lot of conflict in life at the moment, sien sielkundige, sees psychologist, wil nie regtig daaroor praat nie, doesn't want to talk about it, really. Huweliks onmin, marital discord, February begin, neem rescue and Barrel, takes rescue and Barrel, still knocks, something or out, fantasties for slaap. I think it means the still knocks is very good, is fantastic for sleep. Verloor plus gewig, losing a lot of weight. Soybrand en kan nie eet nie, a heartburn and can't eat. Vandag for Botox, today for Botox. The medication was prescribed with repeats for the next 2 to 3 months. Mrs. Rohde had a change in dress sense, behavior at parties, and style of music she listened to. She was seen to dance more excessively than previously and seemed to be more teenage in her dress style. She attended Africa Burn for the first time in April 2016. A lady, 2 people commented on that as being, like they said that was just beyond their wildest imagination that she could have done that. She was described as going wild, being super fine, and being over the top. She had been noticed to be unusually flirtatious, and that included on the day of her death. She cancelled arrangements which seemed highly unusual. And one person said she was making a spectacle of herself.
Dr. Panieri-Peter.
Yes.
Sorry, I must have it difficult to sometimes focus on the information we're giving because it speaks about others. So I'm just going to point that out to you that I'm concerned about that. I'm very concerned about that. This war report speaks about this one said and that one said. So I'm going to leave it to your expertise in the field, and we'll get to your conclusion and how you value this in your scientific opinion.
Absolutely.
And the probabilities that you consider to be of scientific nature.
Absolutely.
Thank you. But let's move on. I think we should move on.
I'll speed up.
Thank you. Before you go on any further, I have a question.
Yes.
Just for the record, what is Africa Burn?
It's a celebratory event in the Karoo, I think, where people gather, and it is a very large celebration where people camp, and there's a lot of enjoyment around issues of, it's environment, sustainable. I'm not an expert on it, but it is an event that is associated with a lot of partying. It has been associated with a lot of sort of dress up. It is a very elaborate event that people enjoy.
It's very jovial, I have to
Yes,
say.
very jovial.
So much so that one of my daughters went to it.
Exactly.
And I believe that my understanding is that people of all ages can attend.
People of all ages can attend.
Carry on.
She started smoking the weeks before her death after having been an ardent anti-smoker all of her life up until then. She seemed to have some conflict with others, including friends, and that was unusual. She started swearing more than before. And a collateral source who was a friend indicated that he tried to tell Mr. Rohde to get her to see a doctor and ask for hormone replacement therapy, thinking that maybe a change in her behavior was due to menopause. She was considerable conflict with her husband. She and her husband would argue more than previously. In marriage counselling, there was significant conflict between Mr. and Mrs. Rohde. They were, however, noted to be able to contain this mostly as they walked out of the door at the end of the session. That was the observation by the marriage counsellor. She was obsessed and preoccupied with details of her husband's affair, his whereabouts, and it was noted that it appeared as if he could not think of anything else. Mrs. Rohde would telephone her husband multiple times a day, would ask him to send photographs of his whereabouts, would track his Uber, and would come to his work and check his desk. These issues were confirmed by the marriage counsellor. Mrs. Rohde confirmed in marriage counselling that she had had a considerable conflict and anger towards her father for having an affair. She became preoccupied with her husband's cell phone, the Facebook of his mistress, and followed the profile of her husband's mistress, her friends, and her family. The marriage counsellor indicated that she did not observe either Mr. or Mrs. Rohde to be overtly concerned about the impact of their behavior on their children. Mr. Rohde indicated, not spontaneously, but only when directly asked, so this is specifically from him, my lady, because nobody else could know this, that Mrs. Rohde had threatened suicide previously, but that he had not thought it was possible that she would kill herself as she loved the children. Mr. Rohde said that his wife had said that she felt dead inside and that she felt like dying and that she was going to jump out of the window of their bathroom. He explained that he just thought it was more of her, to quote, ranting, and he ignored it. The WhatsApp messages of Mrs. Rohde show that she wrote about wanting to die. Mr. Rohde's perspective that his wife would never kill herself because she loved her children was at odds with that of the marriage counselor, who believed that Mrs. Rohde was unable to consider the emotional needs of her children when upset about her husband and his extramarital affair. She used the word unempathic to describe Mrs. Rohde in times when she was angry or upset with her husband in this regard. She indicated that Mrs. Rohde was unable to see how the situation would be affecting her children and that Mrs. Rohde believed her children were fine. It is clear from collateral that the children were not fine. Mrs. Rohde's own clinical psychologist in her testimony commented that in her opinion, Mrs. Rohde had narcissistic traits. My lady, I do have a reference in the DSM to narcissism, and it is there. I won't draw the court's attention to that, other than to explain essentially the concept of narcissism. So there's traits, which means that you have some of the qualities without having it in a fully fledged disorder. My lady, it's a psychiatric term that's used to describe personality, and in its extreme form is a disordered form of personality, and I will talk about it again later when we talk about intimate partner homicide. But essentially, my lady, it is fundamentally rooted in a deep insecurity. Essentially, people feel bad about themselves. They have a poor self-esteem. And the manifestation of that is the sort of opposite. It is like puffed up.
Are you speaking about the disorder now or Mrs. Rohde's traits?
No, I'm saying what the disorder is, and her psychologist indicated that she had a number of traits of narcissism. They are likely to have been her insecurity, which was well described, and her need for perfection and things to appear to be perfect. Mr. Rohde reported that Mrs. Rohde started telling the children not to have children. There's an affidavit indicating that Mrs. Rohde was saying this to people at the conference on the weekend of her death. This was thought to be very odd. Mrs. Rohde demonstrated behaviors that were worrying to others, such as following her husband to his clinical psychologist, flying to Cape Town without luggage, making telephone calls, trying to ram his car into the golf course, and coming to his work and checking on him. These were described in marriage counseling, not simply by Mr. Rohde, and his psychologist described the episode when Mrs. Rohde came to her practice to check on him, saying that this was the first time in her clinical practice she had experienced an episode like this. Mr. Rohde reported only when directly asked and collateral confirmed that Mrs. Rohde's moods had become unpredictable. This was also testified to by Jane Newcomb. He was not sure if her thoughts raced, but he described that her thoughts were jumbled at times. There is no indication to any party at any time of which I am aware that Mrs. Rohde was afraid of her husband per se. She did not admit to domestic violence to any person. The marriage counselor was adamant that Mrs. Rohde showed no sign of fear of her husband in her presence, but rather was confrontational and argumentative and would sometimes talk to him close to his face, moving towards him in an argument. Mrs. Rohde's clinical psychologist was adamant in her testimony that Mr. Rohde did not constitute a physical threat to his wife. She made a specific inquiry into this aspect in response to the word aggression in Mrs. Rohde's notes. My lady, there's a very important reference, which I'm going to make reference to now and later. It's Campbell's risk assessment score, danger assessment.
Could you speak a bit more clearly?
Yes, Campbell's danger assessment. My lady, it's in a bundle, and it comes immediately after narcissistic personality disorder, and it's just a 1 to 20. My lady, this is, so Jacqueline Campbell is a world expert on intimate partner homicide and domestic violence. She has a lot of literature in this regard. And she developed, she and her research team developed what's called a revised 20-item dangerous assessment score. This, my lady, is what one would ask a person in clinical practice if one was worried that they actually were a victim. And this has a significant correlate to danger. So if, for example, one scores between 0 and 6, one would say there's a very low risk. If one scores between 6 and I think it's 11, it would be a medium risk. If one scores over 12, a very high risk. I'm going to read them, my lady, because they were questions that I asked the professionals and have borne in my mind and considered throughout this. So one would ask a person who one suspected was or maybe didn't even suspect, could be a victim of domestic homicide, and it goes like this. Has the physical violence increased in severity or frequency over the past year? Does he own a gun? So you would say yes or no to these. Have you ever left him after living together during the past year? Is he unemployed? Has he ever used a weapon against you or threatened you with a lethal weapon? Does he threaten to kill you? Has he avoided being arrested for domestic violence? Do you have a child that is not his? Has he ever forced you to have sex when you did not wish to do so? Does he ever try to choke you? Does he use illicit drugs? Is he an alcoholic or problem drinker? Does he control most or all of your daily activities? For instance, does he tell you whom and who to be friends with, when you can see your family, how much money you can use, or when you take his car? And Eddie, this goes to stalking and controlling behaviors, which I will talk about later, because they're hugely important. Is he violent and constantly jealous of you? For example, does he say, if I can't have you, no one can? Have you ever been beaten by him while you were pregnant? Has he ever threatened or tried to commit suicide? Does he threaten to harm your children? Do you believe he is capable of killing you? Does he follow or spy on you, leave threatening notes or messages on answering machines, destroy your property, or call you when you don't wish him to? Have you ever threatened or tried to commit suicide? And the total comes out of 20. And lady, when I talk about the characteristics, the typical characteristics of intimate partner homicide, that checklist will come to mind because the features there are described more in detail. Point 29.46, my lady. Mrs. Rohde met with her husband's clinical psychologist on her own at his request. She did not express any fear of him hurting her to Mrs. Long, who commented that Mrs. Rohde's fear was of her husband leaving her. My lady, this particular appointment was very significant to me because in my clinical experience, and I actually treat, unfortunately, a lot of women who have been victims of domestic abuse. And they are very, very frightened of their husbands. And I also have met and encountered some of those men, many of those men. And it's my experience, my lady, that men who pulverize their wives are not excited for their wife or partner to have an opportunity to talk about them without their presence, in the absence of their presence, because that would be exposing and potentially expose their behavior. And that's my experience, my lady. So I was very particularly interested in what Mrs. Long had to say about her encounter with Mrs. Rohde on the one-to-one in that assessment. It did not appear that Mrs. Rohde could contemplate or consider divorce. She did not seem to want that. The marriage counselor was very clear about this. Mrs. Rohde's own clinical psychologist confirmed in her testimony that Mrs. Rohde was committed to the marriage. Point 30. A re-intensification of Mrs. Rohde's mental state occurred in the build-up to the weekend at Spear. This was confirmed by 3 collateral sources, excluding Mr. Rohde, as well as further testimony read in court. My lady, so this is the third part. The first part was the vulnerability, the very long-winded. Second part was the time that was built up to that part, and this is the re-intensification.
Would it be fair to say that the second part extended basically from February 2016 until shortly before the Speed long weekend, and that is covered by paragraph 29 and all its 47 sub-paragraphs?
Yes, I think that would be fair.
And, sorry, I can't hear you.
Yes, it would be fair.
And I think just to place that into proper context, you indicated that the information listed in the sub-paragraphs of paragraph 29 emanated from sources other than Mr. Rohde unless otherwise indicated.
That's correct.
Right. Please carry on with paragraph 30.
A re-intensification of Mrs. Rohde's mental state occurred in the build-up to the weekend at Spear. I've said that, sorry. 30.1. Mrs. Rohde's agitation and anxiety levels returned to the levels seen shortly after finding out about the affair. The marriage counsellor was worried about her mental state, and she indicated she was worried that Mrs. Rohde could lose control. Marriage counsellor described Mrs. Rohde as being in an extreme state on the 20th of July 2016, some 4 days before she died. She described that she had never seen a patient appear like that before her in clinical practice. Mrs. Rohde would not be dissuaded from going to Spear, including by the marriage counsellor. She expressed to the marriage counsellor that she wished for people to see her and her husband together at the function. She expressed to her psychologist that she wanted to be sure her husband was no longer having an affair. She was more preoccupied by her appearance than even in the preceding months. It was confirmed by her daughter and housekeeper. Mrs. Rohde contacted her clinical psychologist on the night before her death via cell phone message and via telephone call. She expressed anxiety and distress during the telephone call regarding a conversation in the bar with friends. She also expressed anxiety about shaking hands with Mrs. Rohde's mistress, concerned that she, as she was, that others would know. My lady, Mrs. Rohde's psychologist made reference to me about this phone call in the very first time that I spoke to her on the phone. Her clinical psychologist described in court that Mrs. Rohde was crying on the telephone and that she gave her advice and support and asked her how she felt afterwards. Clinical psychologist messaged back asking if she felt more in control. Her clinical psychologist testified about this in court, saying that Mrs. Rohde was in tears when she called and yet she felt that she'd been able to be calmed by the telephone call. She described that it took about 10 minutes to calm her. Mrs. Rohde's daughter commented that her mother did not message her in the usual manner during the time in Spear. It is clear that there was considerable and heightened tension between Mr. and Mrs. Rohde during the weekend at Spear, and the presence of Mrs. Rohde's mistress was very upsetting to Mrs. Rohde. Also clear from WhatsApp messages that there was a re-escalation of tension regarding the mistress at this time. Mrs. Rohde had a very angry exchange on WhatsApp with her husband's mistress. The last WhatsApp of 7:06 in the morning appears to have been to his mistress. It was clear from the evidence in court that Mrs. Rohde's psychologist did not discuss Mrs. Rohde with either her general practitioner or a marriage counsellor. The general practitioner also didn't contact Mrs. Rohde's clinical psychologist or a marriage counsellor. In other words, all the treating people hadn't spoken to each other. The psychologist, the marriage counsellor, and the general practitioner, not the three of them, had not had a conversation with each other. Marriage counsellor had, however, contacted a specialist psychiatrist on an urgent basis in an attempt to arrange an urgent assessment and referral of Mrs. Rohde. Upon realizing that her concerns were not being taken seriously, the marriage counsellor also messaged in order to put in writing to both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde about her serious concerns about Mrs. Rohde's mental health and potential risk associated with that. My lady, this is a very big problem in clinical medicine. It is common in clinical medicine, which is that when you have more than one person, it's different from if you're in a hospital where everybody is together. In private practice, we've got different people in different places. It's one of the problem areas and where problems can happen, which is that different practitioners involved in someone's care don't necessarily talk to each other.
I just want to stop here.
Yes.
If you go back to paragraph 30.5,
Yes.
you are relaying what you've heard from Mrs. Newcomb
Yes.
in a communication that she had with Susan,
Yes.
I think either on the Friday or the Saturday
Yes.
while she was at Spear.
Yes.
The impression that I got was that Susan was very much in control and that it was a far more positive rapport with her psychologist than what you are setting out here.
I'm not at all, my lady, implying that she didn't have a positive rapport with the psychologist. I think she did.
Not positive about being in control there at Spears. I mean, she informed her psychologist that she shook Jolene's hand and said, "I hope I never have to meet you again." And then the psychologist responds something like, "Well, did that make you feel good?" There seems to be, it comes across as if Susan's very much feeling positive about herself. But what you are relaying here seems to be very negative.
So what I understood, my lady, was that, and I also spoke to her about it before, she told me that when Susan phoned her, that she was crying on the phone. The psychologist said that there were 2 times when Susan cried. One was after a fight with her daughter, and the other was in that phone call. When she phoned her, she was crying at first. And the way I understood it was that the psychologist was able to calm her, that she was, as the court says, able to calm her in those 10 minutes. And that was when they had the discussion about control and being in control, and that when she messaged back, she said she was in control. That was how I understood it. from both my phone call and from, does that make it clearer? Was it, if I don't want to disagree with the court in the court's
You're entitled to
interpretation.
disagree with me. I'm just saying the engagement between Mrs. Newcomb and Susan, and it might be she would have obviously reached out to her psychologist for some assistance because she may have been upset. But the conclusion of that telephone call seemed to have placed Susan up in her confidence. That's not reflected. If I read this, if I read your narration, it gives a very sad picture of Mrs. Rohde.
Well,
It doesn't confirm that Mrs. Newcomb has now satisfied, that Susan is saying, yes, I'm feeling good. Carry on, you don't have to comment. Proceed.
thank you. And Mrs.
Dr.
Rohde,
Panieri-Peter, I think what we will do is come back to that later in your evidence in chief, and maybe you can, when we take a break, source your relevant clinical file and see if anything more of interest is obtainable from that. Carry on then.
Mrs.
Where are you?
30.7. Oh no, I've actually done, sorry my lady, I've actually finished that. The court will be back. Okay.
No, I think you've done the whole
Yes, I have. I've done the
page.
whole page. Done the whole page. Right. Point 32. It was also clear from Mrs. Rohde's clinical psychologist testimony that many issues raised in Mrs. Rohde in her own notes to the clinical psychologist had not yet been addressed in the process. The intention was, as asserted by a clinical psychologist, to come back to those issues. She said, my lady, that there wasn't time. There was a long process that she had in mind, and they'd only had 8 sessions. And her intention was to come back to many of those issues, and she hadn't had time to do that. That notwithstanding, her clinical psychologist was adamant in her testimony that Mrs. Rohde was not at risk of suicide.
Carry on.
The aforesaid conclusion was reached despite her having elicited and testified to the presence of the following significant factors. Mrs. Rohde was very anxious. So these are all from this is all from Jane Newcomb's testimony. She was very anxious. She had a problematic relationship with her sister, who she perceived as not being able to give her empathetic responses. She was struggling to cope. She was angry. She doubted her own ability. She expressed turmoil as if her whole life had been turned upside down. Experienced. She turned.
Just slow down a little bit.
She started to feel lost. She felt betrayed. She had an overwhelming amount of emotion. She did not want the affair to be the end of her marriage. She was sensitive to being criticized. She was blasé about her health. She experienced pain around the affair. She felt more anxious when Mr. Rohde went away. She checked his telephone and she sent photographs of where she was. She had not told anyone about the affair, and it felt to her that she was feeling isolated. She had a sense that her husband was withdrawing from her, and she would panic, become very anxious, and perseverate and want more details. She was tearful on more than one occasion with her psychologist, once in a session after a fight with her and her daughter and sister, and then when she called on the Friday night before the death. She had been having a strained relationship at times with her daughter. Her clinical psychologist did not have a chance to discuss her comments that she was drinking with. Mrs. Rohde wanted to go to Spear Conference as she wanted others to see that she and her husband were together and that their marriage was strong, and to prove the affair was over. She wanted to present a united front. She telephoned crying on the Friday night after being given a compliment by another man. It took 10 minutes on the telephone to calm her. She had episodes of emotionally spilling over. That was the term that her psychologist used. Her clinical psychologist provided an example of this as explanation for some of her WhatsApp messages, such as, "You are going to die today, and so is she." She described that Mrs. Rohde had emotional outbursts. She explained that when Mrs. Rohde's emotions were spilling over, she was not feeling contained and she was not thinking. Her clinical psychologist indicated further in her testimony to Anya that Mrs. Rohde experienced symptoms of shame, embarrassment, and wanting to hide away. Her clinical psychologist expressed that this was common when one's spouse was having an affair. She further explained that Mrs. Rohde's anxiety caused a dysfunctional cycle in which she became preoccupied with detail. Clinical psychologist knew she was on medications prescribed by her general practitioner, but did not know what type of medications. She also expressed that Mrs. Rohde had narcissistic traits. She also indicated that Mrs. Rohde was not a mouse. She elaborated that she blew up and she took it on. She explained that Mrs. Rohde fought back verbally and was quick to anger. She describes that Mrs. Rohde's anger response was about getting angry and that her husband's was about withdrawal and disengagement. She described that Mrs. Rohde woke up worrying and felt apprehensive when she awoke. She also woke early. She was a perfectionist and concerned about what others thought about her and her family. And she confirmed that Mrs. Rohde was angry and sad, had low self-esteem and did not feel lovable enough, and was insecure about herself. Under cross-examination, Mrs. Rohde's clinical psychologist said, "The thought of suicide didn't enter my mind." She further said that in her opinion, anxiety did not cause suicide, and increased alcohol was not necessarily related to suicide. She did not see Mrs. Rohde on occasions of heightened emotional state, and she did not notice that Mrs. Rohde had lost weight. She further indicated that in her experience, it was mostly patients with personality disorder that attempted suicide, and that there were two types of depression, physiological depression and psychological depression, and they are not necessarily the same thing. She said some people get a physiological depression which comes out of the blue and it's purely biochemical, and there are other people who have psychological depression when something has happened and they can't cope. She said she did not experience Mrs. Rohde as depressed, and she indicated she only met 4 out of the 9 criteria for depression in review. It was her opinion that all of Mrs. Rohde's symptoms, including mood lability, anger, comments about suicide, downloading suicidal things, could be explained by the fact that her husband was having an affair and consequently did not warrant concern for the risk of suicide. She indicated that she thought Mrs. Rohde met the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. She also indicated that she thought there were elements to Mrs. Rohde's state of mind that was similar to a post-traumatic stress response, but it wasn't life-threatening or catastrophic, so it could not be diagnosed as such. She said, so post-traumatic stress is normally upheld with things that literally threaten your life, but at an emotional level, she would experience this as life-threatening in an emotional sense, but not in a physical and practical sense. She did not believe that Mrs. Rohde was agitated. When confronted by WhatsApp sent by Mrs. Rohde, she indicated that they took her by surprise. Later in her testimony, she provided her interpretation for them. She did not believe that Mrs. Rohde's psychology major in her degree meant that she could comment on her own depression. Mrs. Newcomb acknowledged that Mrs. Rohde had told her about the marriage counselor's recommendation of admission. She denied that there was a discussion about suicidality. Instead, she said that she understood the reason for possible admission would be that Mrs. Rohde was feeling out of control and emotionally distressed. She did not know why Mrs. Rohde would have WhatsApped all these therapists are worried about I might kill myself and you act like I have a problem and paranoid on the 26th of May. She did not know about that. Mrs. Newcomb, when presented with a number of WhatsApps from Mrs. Rohde to Mr. Rohde, indicated that they occurred within the context of emotionally spilling over in relationship to her husband, and also that they were at times exaggerated and manipulative to make her husband feel as bad as possible. She did not think that they represented suicide risk or thinking. She described that if her husband started to become non-responsive, then her panic, anxiety, and rage would grow. These included, and I list a number of the WhatsApps that she was presented. Sometimes I want to die. I don't really care anyway because I know for the whole 302 days you were with, you wanted to leave me and you hated me, I could feel it, and that's why I was so sad. 302 days I was sad on the 9th of May. Now for 72 days I felt like dying the 9th of May, and I don't care anymore because you want me to go crazy and that's what you got. 18th of May, you know I'm dying the 8th of June. I'm not living like that the 24th of June. I feel sad for goodness sake, the 26th and 7th of June. Mrs. Newcomb said, having read this, I still maintain she was not suicidal because all these things became, they would resolve. They would have this huge fight, some of which went on for a couple of days. Then they would also have days of real connectedness and a lot of affection and a lot of tenderness between them.
I'm concerned that this report contains a lot of the evidence that was before this court. I'm not sure, with the greatest of respect to you, Doctor, if that's your role, to set out what was previously testified. That's the role of the court. And we are now on page 21. It's heading to 1 o'clock of a 42-page report. I would really be more guided with what your sources of information are, what that uncovered, and what was testified in court, let that be. I've got that.
Absolutely. My lady, it's not in any way my intention to do that. I think what I...
But you are.
Okay, I take that. I apologize. My lady, can I explain what my intention was? Is that because I don't have Susan Rohde here, I'm wanting to, I guess I want to show the court, and maybe that in doing so, I appear to have overstepped the line.
You have overstepped the line.
I have, I apologize for that. That I wanted to show that I have listened to particularly her testimony, because it is important, because Mrs. Newcomb had consultations with Mrs. Rohde. So I don't want it to in any way appear that I haven't heard things that have been said. I will move past the things that have been said in court, and I will try and skip over them in the future, but we're pretty much almost done with them.
I understand the position, Dr. Panieri-Peter. Your objective is to assemble as much information as possible in coming to your evaluation. That includes the products of your consultations and reading and research, as well as important features of the testimony that was presented and that you, psychiatrically speaking, would regard as significant. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So please carry on.
My lady, here I've said in her testimony, Mrs. Rohde's marriage counsellor mentioned. I think I'll just go over those because the court has them. In discussion with me, the marriage counsellor said the following about her last visit of Mr. and Mrs. Rohde 4 days before her death. She was totally agitated. Then she said her eye expression that had disappeared on the Urbanol was back. She elaborated, I'd never seen that before in my office with another patient. Later, upon reading my notes, she elaborated further. The glint in her eyes, maybe it was slight mania. I wasn't sure what it was. It was obvious to me in an earlier session at the end. I knew in my heart of hearts that she needed treatment. And she continued, I don't worry about mental health referrals in general, but I was worried about her, and I don't send people to psychiatrists regularly. I need to go on to...
Right. Just pause there for a
Yes.
moment now. In your own words now, taking this information that you've tabulated and listed here and elicited from listening to evidence, from interviews and so on and so forth, and with particular reference to the 3 discrete stages that you identified, what is your conclusion about Susan Rohde?
My lady, my conclusion is that prior to this crisis, she had a number of vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities were that she had a personality that was high energy, on the go, busy. She naturally didn't sleep for very long. She was a person who had some insecurities. She was a perfectionist. She wanted the world to see the good side of her and her family. She did not share things that were painful to her with others. And she was consequently actually socially isolated in relationship to things that were sad to her and painful. She may have had some genetic risk factors for the development of a mood disorder. These are evidence in some what we might call subtle markers, and I will talk more about this in my conclusion, as well as in some of the aspects of the family history. But I haven't relied on that. In relationship to the crisis that occurred when she discovered that her husband was having an affair, she had, by many different accounts, including professional accounts, a dramatic change in her demeanor and in her emotions. With all the information that I have from multiple different sources, including my interpretations of those in regard to my understanding of psychiatry and the literature in that regard. I would say that she had a major depression, with the specifiers of anxious distress and mixed mood.
Just say that slowly and loudly.
A major depression with the specifiers of anxious distress and mixed mood. And that alone increased her risk of suicide very significantly. The distress of the circumstances of the weekend and the build-up to the weekend, particularly in the way in which I understood from both the psychologist and the marriage counselor what she really wanted to achieve that weekend. What Mrs. Rohde really wanted to achieve that weekend was that everyone would see that she and her husband were together. That she would prove to herself that she won over the mistress.
That you what?
She won. I think she told her psychologist she was 80% sure that her husband wasn't having an affair with her. She wanted to show that they were together. Now, my lady, with the constellation going in of her mood, the anxious distress, her mixed mood, the vulnerability that she had in terms of her personality, and I don't mean this at all in a critical way, but the vulnerability of wanting the world to see her in a certain way, and as well as her social isolation. She was completely alone with this. The circumstances of the weekend must have been the very opposite of what she wrote. Absolute crushing opposite. Which is that rather than proving to the world and to herself that she had won and that her husband was no longer having an affair, it became plain and obvious to her that he still was and that he'd been lying to her. And in terms of her mood, her personal vulnerability, and her sense of self, that would have placed her at risk. What happened on that night is for the court to decide, and I wasn't there, I can't say. But in psychiatric terms, her risk was clinically, psychiatrically evident, and all the bits and pieces of information together, not weighting one particularly more than the other, just all of them together, come together to create in psychiatry that compilation. People who are at risk of suicide don't necessarily kill themselves. And people who are not at risk of suicide sometimes do. So all I can say is that in psychiatric sense, she was, in psychiatric sense, with the information from all different sources that I have, I disagree with her psychologist that she was not a suicide risk. I think she was a suicide risk within my framework of understanding. But I can't say at all what happened.
And obviously without the benefit that the psychologists have of having consulted with her.
Absolutely.
And while we're on the topic of the psychologist, she raised the prospect, or in her testimony and elsewhere, of two types of depression I think she spoke about physiological depression and psychological depression. In recognized psychiatry, as far as you're aware, do these two entities exist? Is there such a thing?
That's not a psychiatric understanding of depression, no.
And I want to ask you to comment on her concluding that Mrs. Rohde was not depressed, despite all the points listed in paragraph 33, and despite no formal special investigation or test having been conducted to check whether she was suffering from depression or not. Is that in line with generally accepted medical or psychological and psychiatric practice?
My lady, when a psychologist suspects or worried about issues of depression, it is expected or thought to be ideal for that person to be referred to a psychiatrist. And if there's uncertainty, my lady, one of the adages that I've used in clinical medicine that was taught to me by a colleague at Falkenberg is, which way would you rather be wrong? So sometimes when one is not sure, that is a good adage. My lady, I've said before that I disagree with Ms. Newcomb's conclusion about risk, even in light of her own observations. In terms of, I think what is unfortunate in this is that her marriage counsellor and her didn't have a conversation. Because what we know is that the marriage counsellor thought there was a very significant risk, sufficient to actually phone a psychiatrist. And I think it would have been very useful if the two professionals could have had a conversation which would have maybe affected that one way or the other.
The marriage counsellor, she didn't sustain that concern when she testified. She said, look, at some point it was a concern, and then it abated for her when she asked Susan about suicide, and Susan very confidently said, no, she'll never do that to her children. I seem to recall that Ms. Nader's concern, it became substantially reduced to a point where she didn't pursue it anymore. You seem to give the impression that that she maintained this concern throughout.
What Ms. Nader told me in my interview with her is that she had two waves of concern. She had an initial wave of concern, which is I think where I've commented that she was at her worst in March, April, shortly after they came. That was at the time when she recommended the psychiatrist, and then things did look like they improved, but in the build-up to the weekend, her concern, she indicated to me, escalated dramatically. And she even said to me that the look and the concern she had was back. And that's what she described to me.
Okay, I'll be guided by her testimony, but carry on. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
My name, may I just request the court to give an indication of time. I have one or two suggestions. The first one is that we adjourn until tomorrow because we're not going to finish this report today. And that overnight everyone reads the second half of the report, so that in the morning we can take it as read. And then I will ask Dr. Panieri-Peter to pick out the highlights of her assessment of the accused, and let us have those. And then any authorities that she feels are important at that stage. And then maybe just bring everything together with her conclusion. The the alternative is to carry on now until 2-ish or whatever, and we will not finish it. I think my suggestion might expedite matters in real time.
We'll unpack your suggestions now. I just want to confirm, Dr. Panieri-Peter is now at the end of the heading which started off with Susan. Am I right? On page 22, and that the next topic would be Jason Rohde.
As a court case.
Thank you. You are done with your autopsy of Susan now. That's right.
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Panieri-Peter?
I think both suggestions can work. I don't have a particular choice on that. All I perceive difficulty at this stage, my lady and I requested, and it is going to be provided to me, all her notes, the 300-400 pages. I have difficulty identifying who she sourced. I might request in writing help with that.
I've expressed that concern. We're talking about the procedure of getting this evidence, getting through this evidence. I want your input as to...
Well, if I can make a choice then, my lady, maybe the first suggestion that we stand over until tomorrow, try and speed it up within a very short period, would be a sensible way to go.
Okay, and that we carry on tomorrow from page 22 till page 42, which is the last page.
Indeed.
And Dr. Peter, is that good enough for you?
Wonderful. I'm totally listening to Mercy and she's gone.
Thank you. Thank you. These, in light of the submissions made by counsel, I think it's prudent now and pertinent to adjourn the proceedings for today. I'll most certainly read the balance of the report from page 22 onwards, with the endeavour that tomorrow Ms. Dr. Panieri-Peter will finalise her evidence in that regard. Thank you. Just a reminder, tomorrow's date?
12th, my lady.
12th of June. There we go. Mr. Rohde, we are carrying on tomorrow, the 12th of June, 2018. We will start at 9:30. If you could be here shortly after 9 so that you get comfortable and settle in. Dr. Panieri-Peter, I will see you tomorrow. Court adjourned.